Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening on this webinar being hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Kate Phillips, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Manager for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. Tonight, I'm delighted to bring you the webinar on Feeding the Ewe, Part 1 for vets and consultants. Our presenter this evening is Kate Phillips. Kate is an independent consultant and is well known within the sheep industry, especially for work in nutrition, and Kate and Lesley, who'll be with us on Wednesday, helped us in working to update the Feeding the Ewe manual. The plan of action is Kate will run through her presentation and then there'll be time for questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout, and so if anybody would like to ask a question, if you could type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and then we'll ask the questions at the end of the presentation. We have over 100 people registered for this evening and hope that technical difficulties will be kept to a minimum. But thank you, Elena, who's working behind the scenes to help us keep everything running smoothly. So without further delay, I'll hand you over to Kate for tonight's presentation.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As you know, AHDB funded a rewrite of the 1988 Feeding the Ewe, the MLC booklet, and Lesley, Stubbings, Kate, myself and Jill Povey set about that task about or not far off 2 years ago now, I suppose. And really, we're giving you a very potted version in these two webinars of that manual. So I do hope you've all got that at least downloaded or a hard copy, because all we can do in these 2 single hours we've got is give you a broad overview of what the manual includes. So just want to say basically what I'm going to do this evening, give you a little bit of an introduction to the manual itself and what we're trying to aim for in terms of Ewe nutrition. I'll talk a little bit about the principles of rumen nutrition and how important it is to manage the rumen and get the optimum fermentation to get the best balance of nutrients out of it. Look at the advantages of maximising the dietary contribution from forage, talk a little bit about interpreting and using forage analysis in diets. And I will focus on energy requirements within this webinar, and Lesley will take on protein requirements in the next webinar. So the Feeding the Ewe manual is very much based on a review of all relevant scientific information that was really created in the last 20 years. So there is actually a very good and extensive literature review that backs up everything we've written in the manual. I've given a reference at the end of the presentation if you want to go and find it on the AHDB website. There's well over 100 pages of scientific referencing and really good supporting material if you wanted further information to back you up in terms of anything that's in the manual. It's very much been developed as a working handbook for consultants, vets and progressive farmers. Probably the average farmer would maybe not appreciate it, but would want the more the simpler version that is in the Better Returns one of the simpler Better Returns manuals. We started off with a workshop at the British Society of Animal Science in 2016 and gathered together quite a few of the people who were interested in Ewe nutrition from all over the country, from Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales, and asked their opinions about what they thought about the current AFRC, that's the Agricultural Food and Research Council standards that were put together in 1993 to see if everybody felt they were accurate and workable with today's sheep. Everybody agreed that the ME requirements, the metabolizable energy requirements, were satisfactory, but there was a sort of fairly unanimous feeling that maybe the MP, the metabolizable protein requirements, should be considered a minimum. So that was where we were starting from. So the manual is very much based on a production cycle approach. So we have sort of broken it down into 4 segments: weaning to mating, the importance of getting body condition score right in that term to optimize conception rates, mating to scanning to make sure we're not losing too much body condition and we're actually making sure animals maintaining condition, so we're actually getting a decent scanning. And then we're moving on to a period from scanning to lambing, which is what I'm really going to focus on this evening, given the limited time we have. And then obviously lambing to weaning and lactation. But what we really knew, I guess, but really confirmed that there is huge interaction from one phase of the production cycle to another. So if we actually have ewes that are far too thin between weaning and mating, we're going to knock on to all other aspects of performance through the whole production cycle. And the whole manual is very much based on getting body condition right throughout the cycle to maximize and optimize performance. So Lesley will very much focus on that, as she's been heavily involved in the AHDB sheep KPI project. So she will cover that in her webinar on Wednesday. So the objectives of Ewe Nutrition are to optimize conception rate and embryo survival, to increase lamb numbers and survival rate, to produce strong, viable lambs, to ensure a good supply of high quality colostrum and milk, to optimize lamb growth rate, to finish lambs when growing most efficiently. So most efficiently means the younger they are, the more efficient they are, keep ewes healthy and to minimize losses, and obviously ultimately for all our clients is to improve flock profitability. Body condition score really is the foundation of managing our ewes from a nutrition and a health perspective, and I just wanted a quick reminder of that here. A vital tool in nutrition planning and health, and a very good predictor of ewe and lamb performance. So we're just simply assessing body condition over the loin, feeling for the depth of muscle and fat. But I'll leave it there in terms of targets and similar things. So just to put it in perspective from a client's point of view, looking at what feed costs. So I just thought it'd be interesting to show you a typical costing for grazed grass would be about 6p per kilogram of dry matter, which would be about half a penny a megajoule of energy. So I think it's well founded that that is our cheapest source of energy available to our grazing sheep. Good grass silage can be as high or even higher than 12p per kilogram of dry matter, effectively doubling the cost of the energy. So by baling, wrapping, cutting, fertilizing, everything else you do to make good silage, it would cost double the amount of money for a megajoule of energy. In terms of barley, at say £124 a tonne as bought, that would be about 14p a kilogram of dry matter, or less 1.08p a megajoule of energy, which actually compares pretty favourably with the good grass silage. So showing that barley, given what the market prices are doing at the time, can be cheaper in terms of energy than even good grass silage. Bear in mind, these are just looking at energy and not protein value. In terms of a compound feed at say £240 a tonne, a typical figure might be 28p per kilogram of dry matter. So that would be in the order of 2.24p a megajoule. So our whole ethos for the book that we put together is to try to maximise the use of forage produced on the farm, hopefully mostly as grazed grass and some grass silage, and to minimise the amount of expensive supplements that are bought onto the farm, which obviously end up increasing the cost of production. It's trying to make the best use of the cheapest feeds and improve grassland utilisation through the year. And how we do that is try to feed the rumen for optimum fermentation. So we say feed the rumen to feed the sheep rather than feed the sheep directly. And just to put it in a graphical form, there we've got the sort of scale in terms of cost of per megajoule. So in terms of the gut, the digestive tract of the ruminant, I'm sure you're all very well aware of what it looks like, but what we're aiming to do is get that rumen functioning at its optimum in terms of maximising the amount of nutrients we get from forage and keeping the ewe healthy. So I occasionally, throughout the presentation, refer to certain sections within the manual, hoping that you have a copy. But the energy section is section 2.3, and this is just sort of some pieces, little bits taken out of that. So a ewe has a fundamental requirement for maintenance, for pregnancy, lactation and growth. So that's what energy is required for. And we talk about rationing ewes in metabolizable energy. So that would be the energy available to the animal. It's not all of the energy contained in a feedstuff, but it's the energy that actually is available. There is obviously some energy that is not usable. So the ME is the gross energy, that's the pile of silage or whatever it happens to be. And if you imagine it's the energy, the gross energy less the loss in feces, urine and digestive gases, so methane and CO2. So that is what's available to the animal. So we talk about two sorts of energy available. So we've got the fermentable energy, and that is available to the rumen bacteria. And then we have FME, fermentable metabolizable energy, is actually directly linked to the production of microbial protein. And Lesley will go into that in much more detail in terms of having a balance of fermentable energy and rumen degradable protein to maximize microbial protein production in the rumen. There's also non-fermentable energy, which is in the form of oils and fats, which don't get digested in the rumen, but move on, get hydrolyzed, but then moved on further down the tract to the abomasum and small intestine. So it's the FME we're going to focus on in this part of the presentation. So in terms of keeping that rumen healthy, a rumen likes to function anywhere between 6.5 pH. So we can imagine we've got this large vat of fermentation vat, and I sometimes like to refer it to like fermenting a good beer, for instance. We could put a forage into that. Now, in the perfect world, the most perfect forage we might be able to put in that would be a good quality sward, a grazed grass sward. And that would be reasonably well balanced with digestible fibre, fermentable energy from some sugars within the grass and digestible fibre, but also rumen degradable protein and a small amount of digestible undegradable protein. But many forages, if you've ever seen very many silage analyses, are not perfect by any means and may be short of fermentable energy, or they may be short of rumen degradable protein. So there may be a need, if we're going to get that forage digested efficiently within the rumen, to add in rumen degradable protein or fermentable energy. So if we need extra ERDP, that's effective rumen degradable protein, we might need to add in something like urea. Not commonly done, other than probably in feed buckets and the like. But if we were looking for a feed, a straight feed, we might have looked at something like rapeseed meal as a source of rumen degradable protein, or beans, those sorts of feeds. If the forage is also short of fermentable energy, we may need to add in some sugar or starch. And the sorts of ingredients we might add in for sugar would be molasses, and sugar beet pulp, some fermentable energy in this form of beet pulp, for instance, or citrus pulp. And in terms of starch, we're largely talking about the cereals, and some of the pulses of the beans would have a good source of rumen degradable protein and a good source of fermentable energy in terms of starch. So we're now getting to the point we've balanced the diet. We've got the right amount of rumen degradable protein and fermentable energy for the bacteria to digest that forage, ferment that forage, and get an optimum digestion. But we have a few extra ingredients we might need to keep everything working properly, and that would be water. It may be some extra trace elements, minerals, for instance, cobalt. The sheep needs a daily supply of cobalt for the rumen bacteria to be able to make vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is involved in propionic acid conversion into glucose. So we need to actually make sure that pathway is working well for effective utilization of the diet. Magnesium is also needed daily and is absorbed through the rumen wall. The other essential ingredient would be saliva for buffering. So if we were adding some fermentable energy, perhaps in the form of starch, we might have the effect of reducing rumen pH, because it's sort of acid forming basically, and the saliva is there to buffer those changes in acidity within the rumen. So we may have rock salt available for use to lick at, which actually stimulates saliva production and helps to buffer the rumen. So this is an essential one to try to keep that rumen pH as close to 6 to 6.5 as possible. Now, in terms of what comes out of the rumen, the first thing we would have coming out and absorbed through the rumen wall would be the short-chain fatty acids, or volatile fatty acids, and those are largely acetate, propionate and butyrate, and they would be absorbed through the rumen wall and off to the liver for processing, and are the major source of energy to the ruminant. The other things coming out of the rumen are the microbial protein. As the fermentation is carrying on within the rumen, the microbes are multiplying, and it is their dead bodies that actually go off through the gut further down to the abomasum and small intestine for digestion as a major source of protein to the ruminant. And of course, then there's the other small amount of protein that comes through, depending on the diet, of digestible undegradable protein, which is that protein that really doesn't get broken down in the rumen and gets passed and digested as we would further down the tract. So the trick is really getting a synchronization of energy and nitrogen sources to get optimal microbial protein produced and a good supply of short chain fatty acids. So that's basically how the rumen works. So it is really how we're trying to ration our animals, is to make sure that that rumen is as happy as it can be to get the best out of any forages and feed we're putting into the rumen. So in terms of other things to think about in terms of keeping that stable rumen, grass, grazed grass, clover or total mixed ration is ideal because we have a constant supply of energy and protein. So no shifts in rumen pH because the animals have got the same diet 24/7. So that's keeping the rumen as happy as it could be. If we are putting concentrates into the diet, we should introduce those very gradually, avoiding sudden changes in food type or food quality so that the rumen is acclimatized steadily to a change. We need to maintain constant frequency and timing of feeding, because ewes get used to being fed at the same time in the day and start fretting, and it basically disturbs fermentation if they're left waiting too long to be fed. We need to feed whole grain rather than crushed or ground cereals if we're putting those into a diet. This tends to slow the fermentation. Basically, the microbes take longer to eat through the seed coat of the cereal, releasing that starch a little bit more slowly so that there's not a big hit of starch going into the rumen. So it's a nice slow digestion. And whole grain is always a good thing for sheep, apart from if you're feeding very, very high quality silage, because the throughput of a very high quality silage can be so fast that it pulls the whole grains through with it. So very high quality silage and TMRs, I would say it's worth rolling grains for, but most average silages, whole grain will be fine, and hays. We need to minimize stress by planning handling and transport of animals to avoid any periods of fasting, because that would affect the rumen flora and the rumen pH. So we need to make sure that anything done close to lambing is as stress-free as possible. And of course, we need to maintain good health. It's all very well having a good diet in front of our sheep, but as you would all know, we need to make sure they're free from lameness, they're free from liver fluke, you name it. If I say the diet isn't good, then health isn't good, then basically feeding is going to be compromised. So just to demonstrate what I mean in terms of putting concentrates into a diet, so if you look at the yellow line, that indicates a rumen pH of about 7 on a forage only diet, and if you looked at the TMR line, we've got a pH of about 6.5, so we've got a nice stable rumen, some concentrates going into that TMR, but they're having the same diet throughout, so there's no changes in pH. But what the average farmer has to do, because they haven't got the equipment or the building layout, they have to feed concentrates twice a day. So feeding concentrates at say 8 o'clock in the morning, and depending on the size and type of concentrates fed, we can get quite a significant dip in rumen pH. The rumen takes quite a long time to adjust to that rumen pH, and then everything gets back to a steady state a few hours later. But then what do we do again? We feed them concentrates again in the late afternoon, and the pH goes down again into a period when in the lower part of the graph, I'm not sure why it's not showing up, but it was there earlier, where we get to around pH 5.5, we're getting little cellulose digestion and certainly getting clinical acidosis below pH 5. So just to demonstrate what putting concentrates in a diet can do to affect rumen fermentation and upset the ewe, basically. So the golden rule in terms of feeding concentrates is not to feed more than 0.5 kilogram in any one feed. So if a farmer needs to feed up to say 3/4 kilogram, that would be need to be split into 2 feeds of 0.375 kilograms at each feed. And just to show you in terms of what we mean in fermentable energy and metabolizable energy, I've got a small table here showing wheat with a very high energy content, that's megajoules per kilogram dry matter, 13.8, and in terms of fermentable energy at 12.8, showing that there is most of the energy in wheat is fermentable, and that's why it is such a potent starch source within the rumen. If wheat was ground, then it would be incredibly potent in the rumen. So whole wheat is a better bet because we release that fermentable energy rather more slowly. Beet pulp, you can see beet pulp is largely digestible fibre and sugar, so it's very much nearly all fermentable energy. It's a very safe way to put digestible energy into the rumen. Hay, you can see we've really got most of the energy content of the hay isn't brilliant at 8.5 megajoules per kilogram dry matter, but the FME is reasonably high, given that hay, unlike silage, doesn't have any volatile fatty acids. There's no fermentation acids. And for comparison, if you look at the silage line, a really good silage here with 11 ME, but the FME is 3 megajoules lower, indicating that the silage is fermented and there are fermentation acids there already, which cannot be fermented again in the rumen. Hence, we've got quite a big significant reduction in available energy to the rumen bugs in a silage than we would with the hay. And finally, a very high oil content seed here with the linseed, the whole linseed at 18.9 megajoules because of the very high oil content. But as you can see, the fermentable energy available linseed is really very low because most of the energy comes in the form of fat. So most problems feeding sheep tend to be related to body condition score. So the whole aim is not to let ewes get too thin or too fat. So hence the emphasis on body condition score, trying to keep within, for a lowland ewe, between condition score 2 and 4 and not getting out at the extremes ever if possible. Feed access is often a big cause for concern in making sure that if certainly if rations are restricted, then every ewe must be able to get its head into the trough at the same time. But if we're talking about feeding ad lib forage, then we must have at least 10 to 15 centimetres per head to make sure that animals do truly have free access to forage on a daily basis. In terms of forage quality, we see quite a few problems with that. The poorer the quality, the higher the level concentrates, and the more problems we run into with acidosis coming into play in late pregnancy when large amounts of concentrates are being fed. And in terms of forage quality, we'd all encourage everybody to get forages analysed and look at the forage in terms of ME and try to keep the best ME silage for the latest, closest to lambing. The poorest quality forage is perfectly all right in mid-pregnancy if that's necessary, but try to build up to the best at the last point in pregnancy. And then, of course, we need to look at the supplements, and we need good quality to balance forage. And I'd encourage everybody to be looking at high quality supplements rather than mediocre quality, because we generally find higher quality the better value for money. So in terms of late pregnancy feeding, nutrient demands are high. The best quality forage should be offered as it'll maximise intake and reduce the need for concentrate supplementation. But under and overfeeding can have negative impacts on performance. So just to show you in terms of the requirements, obviously the requirements are pretty low until we get to the end of mid-pregnancy, and it's only in the last 6 weeks before lambing, if you look at the blue line, when the lambs really start to develop and grow rapidly, that we see a big lift in energy requirements of the ewe in late pregnancy. So in terms of under or overfeeding in late pregnancy, the list on the left-hand side of your screens, underfeeding, we risk low lamb birth weight and low survival. Lambs are born with very limited brown fat, often die of hypothermia, low birth weight, so lose body heat to the environment very quickly. A lot of udder development happens in the last month before lambing, so if we're underfeeding, we don't get good udder weight and mammary development, and hence we tend to get a low production of colostrum. We often see with underfed ewes that there is a weakened ewe-lamb bond. They lick their lambs less, they bleat them less, and basically they're more likely to desert their lambs as well. Obviously, if we're seriously underfeeding, we can run into twin lamb problems, and that's all to do with inadequate energy going into the diet. But that inadequate energy may just simply be not having enough forage access. It isn't necessarily a limited amount of concentrate feed. In ewes that are underfed, they're often slow to lactate because the undernutrition delays the fall in progesterone, and the udder is deprived of the blood flow it needs to access the substrates for colostrum production. And sometimes that colostrum can be very, very thick, and it's very hard for a small, weak lamb to actually pull that colostrum out of the udder. And of course, ongoing effects. If we've got ewes lambing down in poor condition, we have low lamb birth weight. Usually that means reduced lamb growth, and ultimately those lambs staying on the farm an awful lot longer than they should have done if the ewes had been well fed in the first place. So in terms of overfeeding, we have there is a downside, and it's sometimes hard to hit the middle line and get it perfect. But we obviously see oversized lambs and dystocia. We see prolapse, often related to ewes that are overfat. Heavier, older ewes having a lot of lambs, but a lot of internal body fat, and potentially some problems with imbalanced diets, not being digested quickly and getting through the gut efficiently. We can also see these big fat ewes have reduced appetite close to lambing, and they're really quite hard to feed, and they're not particularly hungry, so they can run into pregnancy toxemia and some difficulties with lambing and weakened ewe-lamb bond again. Delayed lactation if we end up with lambing difficulties because of the stress of lambing, often reduced lamb vigor, and of course the potential for the high body condition score to impact on future performance with the ewes. So just a reminder about colostrum production. The amount of energy, especially glucose, available at the end of pregnancy plays a major role in colostrum synthesis, and glucose obviously comes via, often is a major source of glucose is propionate from the rumen, and what we found as evidence within the lit review we did that cereal grains such as maize, barley or wheat have a high metabolizable energy and starch content, and when fed in the last week of pregnancy have been shown to enhance colostrum production, and that will be by being fermented to propionate and being the precursor of glucose. So often a good thing to have some cereal grains in the last week before lambing. And maize is a particularly safe cereal because it isn't as potent a starch source in the rumen, and quite a lot of that starch in maize is protected from digestion in the rumen and is used further down the tract. So that's a fairly safe, high energy, very high energy cereal that can be used in late pregnancy. So moving on to forage quality and dry matter intake, very important to get forage analysed. If anybody is trying to make a diet for a farmer, then we need some information to go on. I would never assume an average figure. It's not useful to the farmer, so get the forage analysed by a reputable laboratory. Lots of compounders will do that, but also you can send it to independent laboratories, and there is a list of those on the AHDB website. So I always say save the best till last, so choose when to feed each silage based on its ME and protein level and the physical appearance, the fermentation of the silage, so the smell, the feel of it. So you can always check the analysis against how the physical feel of the sample you've got to make sure that actually that matches up, because occasionally the farmer may have had a sample analysed, particularly something like a red clover sample that maybe has gone through as a grass silage and hasn't come out with what you'd expect in terms of the results. So if you're getting, for instance, red clover silage, red clover perennial ryegrass sample analysed, you would ask for wet chemistry to be done on that to make sure you get an accurate result. But also this physical checking, squeezing, smelling, and just assessing the silage in terms of fermentation, the digestibility of the forage, and the acceptability of it to the animal. Some physical handling of the silage is a good idea, checking it's free from molds, etc. So we'll move on to what is a good silage in a moment, but just thinking about what affects the intake of silage by a ewe, the dry matter has a big influence. If you have a very wet silage, the sort of silage you can get a handful of and you can squeeze moisture out very easily, then a ewe has difficulty in actually eating large enough quantities of that, simply because she can only take so many bites in a day and chew so many times in a day. So there is a limit if you've got very wet silages. So anything below 25% dry matter is not ideal ideal for sheep. So we should be looking above 25%. pH tells us a lot. If we've got a low pH of below about pH 4, then that starts to impact on rumen fermentation and rumen acidity, and obviously we need more saliva to buffer a very acid silage. The ammonia would tell you whether we've had a decent fermentation, and if too much protein has been degraded into ammonia by the clostridial bacteria within the silage. And that's a good indication of whether we've had a half decent fermentation. So digestibility is really key. The more digestible a silage, so that would be illustrated by the D value, the higher that figure, the more the animal would be able to eat, because it gets digested more quickly in the rumen and passes through quickly. So there's much more capacity to eat that silage compared to maybe a very strong, stalky, big bale silage, which actually takes an awful lot of regurgitation and rumination to get it broken down to a particle size that can actually exit the rumen. The chop length is important too. A long stemmy big bale silage is a lot of work to eat, pulling it out of the bales and then doing the digestion. So we always get much higher intakes on precision chop clamp silage than we would on a long big bale. Presentation is really important too. So we've got nice clean troughs, plenty of trough space, and limited competition. But competition at the bottom, thinking about the poor shy feeders, maybe some young ewes that can't get to the trough or are being bullied out of the way. So it's often very good practice to make sure yearling ewes are in separate pens to more mature ewes, so they don't get pushed out. Likewise, the same would be with older, much older animals. So this is my ideal benchmark for silage for sheep. So I'm saying more than 25% dry matter, a D value of more than 65. Obviously, poorer silage is okay further out from lambing when the requirements for energy aren't very high. But as we get closer to lambing and energy requirements go up, we want to be looking at this sort of silage above 65 D value if we can. So that would be equivalent to an ME of about 10.5 ME. So the higher you go, the less concentrates you need. A crude protein of around 12 would be ideal, but higher would be fine too, as long as we balance it with fermentable energy. A pH of more than 4 if possible, then there's no compromise in terms of palatability and intake. And the ammonia should be less than 10%, so we're not limiting the intake from that. And often a high ammonia is also associated with a high butyric acid content, which is that really vile smell that you get with some silages that you simply cannot wash off your hands. So smell first before you handle silages, I would say. So in terms of hay, quite a different matter with hay. We say good D value for hay would be 58 or above, and an ME of 9 or above would be good too. But you can see huge variation in hays. So you can see some hays with D value and ME of close to straw, sort of 51, 52 D value, and you can see very low proteins. I saw one at 6% protein the other day. Now that would need very significant protein supplementation to make it possible for those rumen bugs to work on that well. So a big demand for rumen degradable protein on that sort of hay. But this sort of hay, 58 D value, 9 ME, is nice hay. And one good thing about hay, it doesn't have any of the negative fermentation characteristics a silage would have. So it would actually be effectively very palatable if it was made well and it was nice and dry and free from molds. I'm just showing you a screen here of a typical silage analysis is done by one of the companies, and if you're going to get into rationing ewes yourselves, then you need some key information, and I just wanted to point out those bits of key information. So if you're looking at energy, we need to look at the metabolizable energy, about the second row down below the energy heading, and we will need the figure for fermentable metabolizable energy. And you can see with this silage, it's incredibly high quality silage, 12.1 ME, but you can see quite a lot of that ME is actually included within the fermentation acids. So we've only got 8.7 megajoules for utilization by the rumen microbes. So, okay, so those are two key things on there. The other one would be of interest in terms of rationing and advice to farmers would be the ash line. Anything below 10% or below 9 or 10% indicates we've got a pretty normal silage. But if we've got a figure of 9 plus 10%, then it indicates soil contamination and a reasonably high risk of listeriosis, particularly if that goes with a high pH and a wet silage. The dry matter is important in the next, if you look at intake characteristics, 24.8 is slightly on the wet side, the silage, but a reasonably high intake because it's very high digestibility. The potential intake line, everybody, is based on feed into milk, not feed into sheep. So I would just like to say that is based on dairy cows. I mean, it is an indicator for us, so the higher the better, but it's not really directly related to sheep. pH of 4, ammonia of 7.6, so those indicate to me we've had a reasonably good fermentation. So we've got the crude protein there at the bottom, and that was 13.4, so a reasonable level of protein, not overly high for the quality of this silage. So just to home in on that a little bit more, talked about those, but the key things if you're going to work out diets or for metabolizable energy and microbial protein are the ME and the FME, and the other information helps to fill in the picture about palatability and intake potential. So here we have the data that we need in terms of protein. So there is another sample. We've got a crude protein of 111, and we've got an ERDP. Remember what we said about the rumen earlier on in the presentation, that we have 76 grams of rumen degradable protein available to those bugs. And we have a much smaller amount of digestible undegradable protein at 12.3 grams, showing that most of the protein within a silage is rumen degradable. Some analyses you will find do not give you the ERDP and DUP figures, but if you want to work it out, you can from the figures below. The A fraction, the digestible soluble nitrogen, the B fraction, which is a much more slowly digested but soluble and digestible in the rumen, and C is the rate of digestion per hour in the rumen. So it is possible to work it out if you haven't got the ERDP and DUP figures, but Lesley will talk to you more about that on Wednesday. So in terms of total mixed rations, just wanted to mention those briefly. More farmers are moving towards this and seeing the benefits of TMR diets. We have to assume a higher forage intake because we tend to get at least 10% higher forage intake in this situation because we've not got the fluctuations in rumen pH. So when I'm formulating a diet for a TMR, I would always ask the farmer to check the forage intake. It's very well estimating the forage intake, but actual figures are much more reliable and would help us to adjust the diet if you are taking more or less than predicted. So a couple of key things: we need to make sure ingredients are well mixed to avoid sorting. That's e.g. lumps of fodder beet or whatever that is going into the diet. It's quite hard with lumps of a root crop to actually avoid animals being very selective. And in TMR, I would say roll grain, so they can't just pick out. You're incredibly good at just picking out an individual grain. So the better the mixing, the better. So we need to make sure everybody has ad-lib access and a minimal competition for trough space. So we need, if it was 70 kilograms used, I would say we need 15 centimeters of trough space for the TMR per head in every pen. And often a case of if you're seeing thin ewes and fat ewes within a pen, then measuring the trough space to make sure there is enough could actually solve the problem and get those thinner ewes actually up to the trough, getting a fair share of what's on offer. TMR must be available ad lib at all times, and likewise forage should be available ad lib at all times. So in terms of working out diets, it's not easy to do calculations on a webinar, I know, but I'm going to have to take you through one or two, not too many, I promise. Working out diets. So the biggest thing we have to estimate is the dry matter intake of the ewe. How much can she actually eat? So we need to predict it. You say it's not a precise science, but we have some guidelines for you. So in terms of a dry ewe, we tend to use a figure of 1.5% of her body weight. So a dry ewe post-weaning or early mid-pregnancy. So for a 70 kilogram ewe, we're looking to an appetite of about just over a kilogram of dry matter. So if she was eating 10 megajoules a 10 ME silage, that would give her about 10.5 megajoules, which would be perfectly all right for that period of her production cycle. In late pregnancy, we anticipate 2 to 2.5% of body weight appetite. So her appetite being driven by her requirements. So for a 70 kilo ewe, depending on the basis of the diet, high quality forage, we expect them to eat more, and low quality forage less, but somewhere between 1.4 to 1.75 kilograms per day per ewe. And in early lactation, the ewe has obviously given birth to the lambs. Her rumen capacity is increased, and she can eat an awful lot more. So we talk about her eating 3.5% of her body weight. And for a typical 70 kilogram ewe, we might be looking at 2.4, 2.56 kilograms per day in lactation. So just to show you what that means in terms of actually calculating it, I don't know if anybody's got a calculator handy, but it just might be interesting just to show you how much can these ewes eat. So ewes eat an 80 kilogram dry ewe. So we'd assume 1.5% of her body weight as her appetite. A 60 kilogram ewe in late pregnancy, we'd assume 2 to 2.5% of her body weight in late pregnancy, and a 75 kilogram ewe in early lactation, we'd assume at least 3.5% of her body weight. So if anybody's got the calculator, you can crack on with that for a minute. But if not, I'll just show you the answers. So the first one, 80 kilogram ewe could eat 1.2 kilograms when she's dry. A 60 kilogram ewe in late pregnancy would eat about 1.4 kilos, and a 75 kilogram ewe in early lactation would eat about 2.7 kilograms of dry matter. So converting that to grass fresh weight, if we assume the grass is 18% dry matter, which it could be on a fairly dry day in the spring, we would say that ewe would eat 6.7 kilograms of fresh grass. This one would eat 7.8 kilograms, and this would eat a very big pile of 15 kilograms of fresh grass. So just to give you an idea, the scale of the differences in what each individual animal would eat according to the stage of the production cycle. And 15 kilograms of fresh grass is quite a big pile to provide in terms of daily requirement. So anyway, but that hopefully gives you a little guide in terms of what appetite limits we're talking about for ewes at various stages of pregnancy. Okay, so another way of working out how much forage they might eat, that was total dry matter intake before, but this table is taken from an SAC publication, which was produced a while ago, but I think it's quite a good easy way of estimating how much supplement ewes might need on different forages. So you can see we've got straw at the top at 6.5 ME, obviously a poor quality forage, needing a fair amount of supplementation depending on when the ewe, what part of the cycle she's in. But at 12 to 3 weeks pre-lambing, we'd assume she would only eat 1% of her body weight from forage. Okay, so we're talking about offering a ewe ad-lib straw, maybe a kilo and a half of straw, with her eating half of it, 0.75 of a kilo. But close to lambing, we assume with poor quality forages that appetite goes down because they're hard to digest and rumen volume has gone down. But so they'd eat a little bit less close to lambing. And you can see with all the different forages in the list here, you can see that the potential highest intake of forage are for the good hay, the 9.5 ME hay, with 1.8% of intake 12 to 3 weeks before lambing, and likewise for a very good silage at 11.5 ME of 1.8% up to 3 weeks before lambing. Now we tend not to see as much of a reduction on high quality silages as we do on poorer quality silages, so that we don't see that reduction in intake close to lambing. They just tend to keep it fairly stable with only a drop in intake in the last week or so before they actually lamb. So I thought I'd take you through an example of how to work out a diet for ewes based on this and a 12.5 ME cake. So I'm going to choose the good silage line, 10.5 ME, and work with the figures: 1.6% of body weight as forage intake at 12 to 3 weeks and 1.4% of body weight from 3 to 0 weeks pre-lambing, and just walk you through one example calculation. They're the energy requirements taken directly from the AFRC 1993 book, and we'll work to the 70 kilogram ewe. We're having twins. If you look at the bottom line, 11, 13, 15 and 18 megajoules required. That would be the full requirement. I may in practice be rationing only to 17 megajoules just from 1 week before lambing to avoid excess levels of concentrates going into ewes, as long as ewes are fit. So calculating a diet for a 70 kilogram ewe expecting twins. So we've got the good silage with 10.5 megajoules of ME, and we said in the previous table she would eat 1.6% of her body weight as that forage. So 1.6% of 70 is 1.12 kilograms of dry matter. And given that it's 10.5 megajoules for every kilogram, that equates to 11.8 megajoules of energy coming from silage alone. Now, it's hard to link these up, but I just wanted to say at 7 weeks pre-lambing, a ewe needs about 11 megajoules. So you can tell immediately that this ewe needs no supplementation at 7 weeks pre-lambing, because the silage alone is giving her all the energy she needs. In fact, she's got a slight surplus of energy on this good silage. As I said to you, sometimes poorer silages are fine more weeks out from lambing. But this one is fine at 7 weeks with no supplementation. So if we do the calculation again at 5 weeks when she needs 13 megajoules, you can see now she's short of about 13 minus 11.8, 1.2 megajoules of energy. So we now have to work out whether it's worth supplementing the ewe to give her that 1.2 megajoules. So we got 1.2 megajoules, and I just want to point out the figure I've used there, the 10.75, is a 12.5 megajoules per kilogram dry matter compound, corrected for the moisture in it to correct it to the as-fed figure. So I've assumed a moisture content of 86%. So I've simply multiplied 12.5 times 0.86, and I've got with 10.75 megajoules per kilogram as fed. So the 1.2 megajoule deficit divide by 10.75 gives us 0.11 of a kilogram. Now, the debate then is that worth feeding? It's a very tiny amount of concentrate, and it would be hard to feed that in a trough to make sure every ewe got its fair share. And generally, we would say that the minimum amount you would feed in a supplement would be 0.2 of a kilogram. You could obviously put that into a TMR diet, 0.11, because it would be spread evenly. But if trough feeding, that would be difficult to justify. So my decision would be made whether to offer that amount would be based on the condition score of the ewes. And if I felt the condition was dropping, then I would go in at 5 weeks with 0.2 of a kilo. If I felt the ewes were very fit, I wouldn't start feeding the concentrates then. If we do the calculation, I've missed out the 3 weeks just to get it all on the page, but if we do the calculation at 1 week pre-lambing, assuming the appetite for forage has gone down a little bit, and we're now needing 18 megajoules, so we've got 1.4 times 70 gives us about 1 kilogram of dry matter. See the 0.98. 0.98 of a kilogram of dry matter at 10.5 gives us 10.3 megajoules from forage. You can see immediately that we have a 7.7 megajoule deficit, so we need to find that from a supplement. So if we were going to be feeding the ewe the full requirement taken from the AFRC book, we would then do the same calculation I did before, but 7.7 divided by 10.75 equals 0.72 of a kilogram of compound. Now, what you might prefer to do in practice is flatten this out, because if you do start feeding concentrates at 5 weeks pre-lambing at 0.2, you might only get to 0.6 at lambing. They've had the same amount of concentrates over the 5 weeks, but you've flattened it out a little, so we're not getting too much impact of the higher level of concentrates just close to lambing. And I'm not going to run through it again, but just if you did the same calculations with a different forage, you can see on this table I've got two forages, 10.5 ME and 9.5. If you look at the silage ME column, and it basically equates to about 10 kilograms difference for 1 megajoule change in silage ME. So, and that could for a farmer mean up to £2.40, depending on what he's paying for his concentrates. But if they're £240 a tonne and you're saving 10 kilos by having that better silage, then that's £2.40 saving. So trying to encourage better silage making and better silage quality to reduce the cost of purchase supplements. And finally, just one last slide, just in case you want to check on the energy levels of the ewe, you might want to look at some metabolic profiles. I guess this is a service vets will be offering to their clients, sampling ewes at 3 to 4 weeks pre-lambing, looking at the beta-hydroxybutyrate, and checking that we've got the right level and we've not got too many ewes going into having high levels of BHB, looking at blood urea, measuring whether we've got an RDP sufficiency or an excess. We don't want too much. If we've got too much urea, it suggests we've got a lot of surplus rumen degradable protein, and we need to check the protein levels within the diet. If we've got high levels of BHB, obviously we need to check the energy. But I just want to emphasize the fact that it might not be the fix of anything wrong in this department, might not be just putting more concentrates in. It might actually be looking at the forage and forage access and their whole feeding arrangements, rather than anything to do with the amount of supplement being given. Right, thank you for listening. I feel I've raced through that a lot, but any questions from anybody? And just one finally, oh, sorry, I do have a list of references. The Feeding the Ewe review is on the AHDB website somewhere. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. Just while I'm waiting for some questions, just a reminder, the questions box is on the right-hand side of your screen. I'd just like to remind you that the presentation has been recorded this evening and will be available on the AHDB YouTube channel, probably normally within a couple of days, and you will get an email to remind you if you do need to go back and watch anything again, just to remind yourself. And also, if you haven't already got the Feeding the Ewe manual, that is also available on the website, or you can email or call us at BRP to get a copy. So we're a bit slow on questions this evening. Somebody must have a question that you want to ask. So please write some questions. We've got one here though, Kate. Is fodder beet a suitable supplement for energy lacking in poor quality silage?
Yeah, fodder beet is basically mostly sugar. Okay, so it is a very good source of fermentable energy, but it can be as potent as cereals can in the terms of causing acidity in the rumen. So you have got to be careful how you feed it and how much you feed of it. So, but no, it is a very good source of fermentable energy. It's got some fermentable fiber, obviously, but a lot of the energy in fodder beet comes from sugar. So, but yeah, very good if you're short of FME and you're not feeding too large quantities of it. So, yeah, it's a good supplement. Ewes love it. I know various people grazing in situ with fodder beet, but also often putting it in chopping it up and putting it in a diet, or just literally throwing it in the pens for use to gnaw at as a little extra something. But yeah, a good source of FME. Very low protein. Just want to add, it's a very low protein feed. So if you're putting substantial amounts of fodder beet into a diet, you really do need to make sure that there's adequate rumen degradable protein.
Okay, thank you. How do you account for substitution when calculating the diet?
Well, that table actually does account for substitution. Okay, so that is assuming a drop in intake, but allowing the substitution to come into play. So yes, there is. If you've more concentrates you feed, you will be actually reducing forage intake. So must allow for that. If you're getting to certainly high levels of concentrate do inhibit forage digestion. So you need to be very careful.
Okay. What is too large a quantity? Can you eat enough of it as dry matter if it's too low, or will they not just eat enough?
They just won't eat it. You know, that table, the SAC table, is quite useful in terms of showing you the sort of limits according to forage quality. So they just cannot eat enough of a very mature. Well, a straw is a good example that I went through. Only 3/4 kilo of straw to be eaten. You know, that they just cannot digest it well. And you've just got to make sure that you make up the supplementation. Good thing with straw is we know it's low quality, so we do supplement it properly. Nobody assumes anything of straw, but quite a lot of people assume wrongly a silage may be better than it is, or vice versa, and feed too much or too little. So having the analysis there is really key to it, really.
Okay. The energy requirements only go up to 80 kilogram ewes, but a lot of her clients have got 90 to 100 kilogram ewes. What's your best advice for those heavier ewes?
Well, I would say make sure to look at what point you're estimating your weight of the ewes. So we tend to think about ewes around about topping time as a sort of a mature weight just pre-topping. So think about that. Don't think about the ewe heavily pregnant, because that's a very different weight of a ewe. With twin lambs, you know, you could add another 15 kilos. But what I would do, and this is what I do in practice, is look at the energy requirement table and literally work up in the same increments between. So if you had a 70 kilo ewe, if anybody's got the manual in front of them on page 28, if I have a 70 kilo ewe having twins at 3 weeks before lambing, she needs 15.3 megajoules. And I have an 80 kilo ewe having twins at 3 weeks before lambing, needing 17. So I would look at the differential between that, and that is going to be 1.7 megajoules. And then I would simply add 1.7 megajoules for the 90 kilogram ewe. I hope that's clear.
Yep, no, that's great.
Okay.
Can silage ever be too dry?
I don't think it can, really. I don't think it can. You know, and then nobody has defined the line between silage and haylage. So I really don't think, I've not run into any problems with because if you think sheep do very, very well on hay, and that doesn't cause any problems, so it's only a small transition to a big bale silage that's dry. So no, I don't think it can. Sometimes it can be, well, take that back slightly. It can be, if you're putting big bales into a feeder wagon to feed as a TMR, they can be too dry because they take an awful lot of chopping. And some water might need to be added in a TMR just to make it mix properly and cut easier.
Okay. Is there an ideal period to decrease body condition score at all in ewes?
The only time we're really happy with losing body condition is in an early lactation. So if a ewe lambs down at condition score 3, we really don't mind her losing a condition score in early lactation. But we don't want her losing condition anywhere really from mating, very much mating through to scanning, really, or scanning to lambing. So we want to maintain body condition. As one thing our review has really highlighted to us, that losing condition is a negative thing, really. A small amount of slimming and very fat ewes might be worthwhile, but any great loss in condition, maybe from scanning to lambing, would be very detrimental in terms of lamb birth weight and viability. And likewise, we don't want to see any big shift in condition between mating and scanning, because we tend to lose embryos in that phase. So yeah, we're really feeling that we need to maintain condition more consistently now than we have before. So no big shifts other than in early lactation. So if a ewe lambs down at body condition score 3, loses a condition score, hopefully she's putting all that into her lambs. But if she lambs down at condition score 2, she hasn't got the body reserves to actually feed her lambs well, and those lambs will do badly unless the ewe has masses of grass to go at when she's turned out. So that's a critical point. A thin ewe can eat a lot and can eat up to 30% more than a fat ewe. So if a thin ewe is given plenty of food, she can compensate for her lack of condition. But as in many springs, there isn't enough grass to go at, and those thin ewes do badly and rear their lambs badly.
Okay. Are there any predictive equations available for silage D and ME robust enough for high clover or lucerne?
Not as far as I know. I'm not involved in any laboratory analyses, sort of ring tests and the like, but there has been extra research done. I know Liz Jennifer may be able to help us a little bit. There certainly was some work going on red predictive of energy in red clover, but I haven't seen that information. Katie, would you know that's available?
I haven't seen anything of late.
No.
So.
Right, thank you. Just making sure I hadn't missed it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really critical, you know, that somebody on the last webinar asked about an 11.2 ME red clover silage, which I hope they had analysed by wet chemistry, because we do. I did see one the other day that in theory had 28% protein, and I didn't believe it. I think it had actually been put through a standard NIR for a grass silage, this red clover, and I insisted on it being reanalyzed, basically.
Okay. What's your opinion on winter crops such as brassicas? Do you have any nutritional concerns or welfare concerns?
Well, starting with welfare, I suppose, yeah, they can look horrendous. They can look very muddy, and sheep can look very miserable on winter crops, but nutritionally they are pretty good. I mean, if you think about stubble turnips, an awful lot of sugar, digestible fiber, a reasonable amount of protein if the tops are there as well. So strip grazing, stubble turnips gives a good diet to use. Likewise, rape and kale. We can get some nitrate poisoning with some of these, but generally speaking, they're good nutritionally, apart from their lack of trace elements, so particularly iodine. So we need to make sure we supplement ewes that are on root crops with iodine, particularly. But no, very, very high nutritional value. Some risks sometimes of ewes getting too fat on those crops. So that hence strip grazing is better in allowing them an allocation to give them the right dry matter intake and the right amount of energy. So if just giving them free rein and ad lib, they could get really quite fat. And with the counter side of that being getting on their backs and getting, and dying potentially, if not put up right again.
Okay. If their silage is very wet or low dry matter, does that limit the amount that they'll be able to eat?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. As I said, they can only take so many bites in a day, and the more water they take on, the more mouthfuls they need to take on to meet the energy within that and within a volume. So yeah, very wet silage, not ideal for sheep. It just is more limiting. They just can't manage to eat the amount of dry matter they might need in a day. So in that case, if that's all you've got to work with it. But if you had some way of giving some drier forage as well as that would be a good compromise.
Okay, right, for just our final question then. If ewes are out of dairy land up until about 1 to 2 weeks before lambing, would you get the grass analysed and potentially supplement out at grass? They're just a bit worried about a sudden dietary change before lambing.
In the perfect world, we would acclimatise the animals to their indoor diet before they come in. Yeah, we would. My experience with dairy grazing is that often ewes come back incredibly fat from dairy grazing. So the risk is more of overfatness and prolapsing, I think, coming back from there. So it's a bit of a tricky one to manage. A lot of farmers maybe leave it a little bit too late coming back, but it's often a very economical way of keeping their ewes through the winter. But in the perfect world, if you were changing, you're bringing ewes in from really nice grass into a shed onto much poorer quality forage, then yeah, it would have been preferable to have had the forage and a small amount of concentrates to acclimatise them to their new diet before coming in close to lambing. Getting the forage analysed, the grass analysed, you could. I've been very pleasantly surprised how good some grazing is through the winter. Getting up to 11 megajoules per kilogram dry matter for good quality grass in the winter. So it can be incredibly good, even under snow. I'm not sure it's worthwhile. Dry matter's changed daily almost through the winter. We've got snow cover, we've got rain, whatever. So you might get a very odd analysis if you did it one day and you get a different dry matter the next. So that would be a bit tricky. You would get an idea of the digestibility and the protein. Generally, proteins are quite good if it's not long, stalky, stemmy grass. And on a dairy farm, it's likely to be quite lush and green. So it's likely to be high quality. And I think the best thing is to be monitoring body condition of those ewes.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for everybody for listening this evening. We've had a great turnout and some good questions, so thank you very much. I hope you have all signed up ready for part 2 on Wednesday this week. If you haven't, it'll be the same time. So if you go to the website, you'll be able to find the link to sign up or on the email that we sent round. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and I hope you've all got at least 1 or 2 things to take back to your clients and implement on their systems. So thank you very much, Kate, and hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Katie.